Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a wonderful lunch today. So the topic for now, we're going to session 10. This is session 10, also profit food, opportunity, and research needs. I'm Dan Ramdath, and here we have authors.
Yeah, I'm Marinangeli with Berkeley Canada. Very excited about this session. Ultra-processed foods, fairly contentious issue in the world of food economy, implications across the food system, influencing how food innovation is happening, how consumers are interpreting food, and how government agencies are applying the regulations and policies. So very happy about this session. Our first speaker is talking about ultra-processed foods. Is a useful classification system for obesity and cardiometabolic disease prevention. You are I apologize. Is that okay?
Hi everyone, this will be a tricky session for me because we're just about to digest after a delicious lunch, but also because the topic is not one of the easiest topics. So I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm also kind of afraid to talk about it because I know there are lots of controversies about ultra-processed foods, but I mean, I'll be happy to address your questions, but also to engage in very fruitful discussions. So what I want to talk about today is whether the ultra-processed food classification is a useful classification when we talk about cardiometabolic disease, whether it is a complete classification, and how do we see things moving forward. Just a small slide about my conflicts of interest. So the funding that we receive in our team are solely public and associated funding from the French National Agency for Research, Cancer Institute, or from our employers, or from the European Research Council, the French Ministry of Health, and other associative. So before we delve into the main topic about whether we can say that ultra-processed foods are a beneficial classification when we talk about a cardiometabolic disease, let me just give you a quick idea about what we know about ultra-processed food. What is ultra-processing? And I'm going to focus exclusively on the NOVA classification because it is the classification with the most published evidence and papers. So the NOVA classification, I think you may have heard about it, was born in Brazil, in the University of Sao Paulo, around the year 2009, 2010, by the team of Professor Carlos Monteiro. And what was kind of special and specific about this classification is that it focuses on the degree and the purpose of food processing and not on the nutrient profile and the nutrient composition. So just to be quick, I won't go too much into details. NOVA classification categorizes food into 4 groups, ranging from unprocessed, minimally processed foods. So here we would find foods simply after removing non-edible parts, pressing, cooking in water, refrigerating, just really some simple processes. In the second group, you have the culinary ingredients. So you would find salt, oils, animal fats, vegetable fats as well, honey, butter, etc. So these foods are normally not consumed individually, but they are used to prepare foods from group 1 to get the group 3, which are processed foods. So as I said, these are foods from group 1 that are prepared by using foods from group 2. I will give you some examples in the next slide. And the group 4 is ultra-processed foods. So these are formulations with whole foods or without any whole foods, formulation of substances derived from foods to which we have added food additives. And I will tell you later on about the role of food additives in these groups. And as I said, these groups contain few or no foods from group 1. They are generally hyperpalatable and have a longer shelf life. So if we go back to the original classification, the way it was described by Professor Monteiro, so the processing techniques that are concerned in order to consider the food as ultra-processed. So as you can see here, subsequent processes involve the assembly of unmodified and modified food substances with little, if any, whole food, using industrial techniques such as extrusion, molding, pre-frying. The assemblage is frequently added of preservatives, colorants, flavors, emulsifiers to make the final product palatable or hyperpalatable. So if we want to rephrase a little bit, we try to crack foods into food substances and then we reassemble them, and we can add food additives, emulsifiers, etc., to give them the shape, the taste, and the look we want them to have. So we talk about food substances and cosmetic additives. So food substances, as I was saying, they are what we get once we crack the foods into whey protein, fructose, high fructose corn syrup from corn, fruit juice concentrate from fruits, soy protein isolate from soya, etc., which we would combine all together. And then we would add cosmetic additives, and the word cosmetic means that it has no essential microbiological role. And one of these, an example of these cosmetic additives are flavors, flavor enhancers, colors, emulsifiers, etc. So just let me give you some examples about ultra-processed foods. So as you can see here, you will find sodas, chocolate and energy bars, instant noodles, dehydrated soups, fish and chicken nuggets, slimming products, powdered or fortified meals. So as you can see here, it's not really what we used to know as junk food. It's kind of a different classification because the foods kind of fall into different food groups, not just the junk food group that we used to know before. Just a slide that I found important to talk about is that ultra-processed foods and industrial foods are not mutually exclusive. So here you can find two examples of industrial food. The one with ingredients that you can see above, so with stock, water, leeks, carrots, onions, etc., turnip, leeks, salt, parsley. And the second one with dried glucose syrup, potato starch, dried carrot, onion powder, palm oil, etc. So you can find that even in the food group of industrial soups, some of them can be classified as processed. So this is Nova 3, and some others are ultra processed. So this is Nova 4. Where do we stand according to the consumption of ultra-processed food in different countries? So this is from a review paper that we have published last year, and as you can see, there is a big heterogeneity of where countries stand according to the consumption of ultra-processed food, and you can see that it can range from approximately 15% for countries like Romania, up to 60% for countries like the US and the UK. And in Sweden, for instance, we're around 40%, in France, around 30%. And so this is why we were interested to study ultra-processed food and their links with chronic disease. So I will start by talking about what we did in our cohort, and then I will give you a broader overview of what's happening around the world, and I will try to answer the big question of this talk, whether ultra-processed food is a useful classification or not. So I'm going to be showing you some slide about our cohort, that is the Nutrinet Santé cohort study. That is a cohort we launched in 2009 with more than 173,000 adult participants. And we have a very detailed assessment of dietary exposures in the form of 3 24-hour dietary records every 6 months. That we couple with a large amount of complementary questionnaires about sleep, cooking practices, mode of production, professional exposures. We also have validated health events through a linkage to medical administrative databases and registries. And we have also a biobank. And what we did was use these dietary data that we have. So at least 3 24-hour dietary records every 6 months. So in most of the studies that I'm going to be showing you, we use between 3 and 18 dietary records. And we classified all the dietary foods that we have, all the foods and the drinks that we had in these dietary records according to the NOVA classification. This is just a simple photograph of the tool that we use for the portion size calculation, and I'm going to be showing you another slide about how we define the brand of the food in order to have a more concise and accurate classification. But before I do that, let's just wrap up around the results that we observed in Nutrinet Santé. So after we classified the foods according to their level of processing, according to NOVA classification, we calculated the share of ultra-processed food in the diet according to the weight and the amount of the food that we ate. So if, for instance, we ate kilos of food per day and we ate 200 grams of ultra-processed food, then the share of ultra-processed food in the diet would be 10%. Once we calculated this for every single participant of our cohort, we did associations, we studied the association with the risk of having a cardiovascular disease, a coronary heart disease, and a cerebrovascular disease. And as you can see here, so this is for an increase of 10 points in the share of ultra-processed food in the diet. You can see that for an increase of 10 in the share of ultra-processed food in the diet, the risk of cardiovascular disease increases by 13%, the risk of coronary heart disease increases by 15%, and the risk of cerebrovascular disease increased by 11%. We also studied the association with mortality, and as you can see, also for an increase of 10 points in the share of ultra-processed food in the diet, the risk of mortality increased of 14%. Also talking about diabetes, because that's why we're here, we studied also the association between four types of ultra-processed foods, but also those response exposure to ultra-processed foods and the risk of having type 2 diabetes. And as you can see, we observed a linear association between a higher share of ultra-processed food in the diet and a higher risk of having type 2 diabetes. So here we have approximately an average of 7 to 8 years of follow-up from 2009 to 2020. We also studied the associations once again in Nutrinet Santé with overweight and obesity. And as you can see on this plot, so these are the biggest consumers of ultra-processed foods, and these are the lowest consumers, quartile 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as you can see at baseline, participants in quartile 4 had a higher BMI, and then across the follow-up, along the follow-up, you can see that they gained more weight between year 1 and year 9. And the risk of obesity and overweight was also higher in quartile 4 according to quartile 1. So ever since we did these studies, there are now approximately 90 studies, 90 cohort studies around the world investigating the links between ultra-processed foods calculated by the NOVA classification and the risk of cardiometabolic disease. So this is a summary we did for the reviews that were published last year. The number did change ever since. So when we did the review, we had 67 studies based on NOVA classification. 70% of each included more than 10,000 participants, and 25% of each included more than 100,000 participants. Approximately all of these studies adjusted for socioeconomic demographic factors, but also they adjusted for total energy intake, and 42 of them adjusted for dietary content of key nutrients or diet quality indexes. So this is really important because, as you can see here, even when we do adjust for key nutrients or diet quality indexes, the association between food processing and health remains. 52 out of 58 studies that explored outcomes beyond obesity also accounted for BMI. So definitely BMI can be a confounder and a mediator, but it's that the association is not entirely mediated by BMI. And then there are also studies in children and pregnant women, but I will not go into details about these studies. This is an umbrella review that was published in March 2024, an umbrella review of all the meta-analyses that were available on ultra-processed food and chronic disease. So here, I'm just going to show you what we observed for type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and mental health. So the authors used the credibility scale and the grade scale. And as you can see, for type 2 diabetes, there was solid evidence for associations between ultra-processed food and type 2 diabetes. The evidence was a bit milder for obesity, but it was still kind of moderate. And we did have convincing credibility for cardiovascular disease and also a highly suggestive credibility for mental health. In terms of randomized controlled trial, one of the most famous randomized controlled trial about the subject was what has been conducted by the team of Kevin Hall, showing that two randomized groups were assigned whether to have an ultra-processed food diet or a non-ultra-processed food diet. And as you can see, during the ultra-processed food diet period, because it was a crossover trial, the participants gained more weight and consumed more energy than when they were on an unprocessed diet. We also have some other clinical trials, but this is the biggest and the most convincing one. What we tried to do right here is to summarize the evidence of ultra-processed food and links to chronic disease. So here we have the components of ultra-processed foods and here you would have why they would have an impact on cardiometabolic disease. And here we try to summarize the mechanism that we suspect behind these associations. So as I was saying, ultra-processed foods can be on average high in energy, sugar, salt, but it's definitely not the only reason why they might be associated with chronic disease. Because as I was saying, when studies adjusted for nutrient quality, the associations remained. We also have changes in the food matrix and texture that is linked to processing, but also contaminants from processing, such as acrolein, furans, acrylamide, trans fatty acids, etc. We also have a formulation of ultra-processed food being a formulation of attractive and profitable products with long shelf lives. This is why they have food additives and contact materials since they stay for longer times in their packagings. So we might have a higher exposure to coloring agents, sweeteners, emulsifiers, corn syrup, maltodextrin, etc. And in terms of contact materials, bisphenol, phthalates, and mineral oils. So if we look into all of this, we can have association with cardiometabolic disease that can be more mediated by, and we have had some studies about this, by serum lipid concentration. So we have had some studies on ultra-processed food and lipid profile, by obesity, as I was saying before, inflammation as shown in some studies, oxidative stress, dysglycemia, insulin resistance, and even hypertension, which could lead to a higher risk of cardiometabolic disease. Right now, let me go into details about what I've been talking about right here. So let's focus on food additives. So why study food additives? We know that in most of the dietary surveys that we have, we can ask the person whether they consumed a chocolate cookie, for instance, and if we're interested in sugar or salt, then having an average value for sugar and salt or fat for chocolate cookies might be okay. But then if we're interested in food additives, as you can see between these 5 brands of food additives, of chocolate cookies, there is a huge difference in the number of food additives used in each of the products and also in the amount of food additives. So let me go back to how we measure food additives and ultra-processed foods in Connect. So as I was saying, we asked the participants to provide the portion size using validated photographs, but then here I took an example of a dish from the southwest of France that is called cassoulet, which is some beans and sausage and lots of gravy. And you can have it home cooked, but also you can eat it in a restaurant or in a restaurant or in your work canteen, in your school canteen, but also you can buy it as a ready to eat product. So once the participant declared consuming cassoulet, we would ask them where they got this cassoulet. 2 or 8? 2 minutes, okay. If we do not have the information about the brand of food additives, so you can see that we cannot have an exact information of the exposure to food additives. So we use different databases to calculate the exposure to food additives, and then We did some studies that I will not have the time to discuss right here, but here is a summary about them. So we found association between nitrites and cancer risk, type 2 diabetes and hypertension, artificial sweeteners, cancer risk, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, but also emulsifiers and cardiovascular disease, cancer, and type 2 diabetes. I still have 2 minutes to answer the question that I still haven't answered. Is NOVA classification useful? So as I was showing you, we have had empirical validation by the consistency of the numerous epidemiological studies, some of which, like the Nutrient Santé, with very precise dietary assessment. So NOVA can be useful if it's used as recommended. So we have published a paper on the best practices on how to apply the NOVA classification. And as you can see here, we do need information about branding, about where the product was provided, the list of ingredients, etc. And whenever we do not have any of these information, we lose some precious information that we need to go and get elsewhere, or we need to get some proxy about these information. So why study food additives as a marker of ultra processing? So previous food additive assessments by a public health agency focused on toxicological metrics, but none of them focused on metabolic or microbiota perturbations that were found in recent studies. So there is definitely a need to reevaluate food additives, which is one of the strengths of ultra-processed foods, to have a holistic view of food additives. So NOVA is a tool to classify foods according to their degree of processing that has shown consistent association with human health. However, NOVA is not a tool aiming to replace nutrient profiling systems. NOVA should not be used as a tool to replace nutrient profiling systems. These are two different dimensions that need to be both considered. So the way I see things is that at the level of the food product, NOVA and nutrient profile can be complementary dimensions. So of course you can have a food that is high in salt, high in fat, etc., but not ultra processed. And then you can have a food that is ultra processed, but on the nutrient profile dimension, it has a fair nutrient profile dimension. So these are two complementary dimensions when we look into food products, but the way NOVA was built at the food system level, then NOVA and nutrient profile on the food system level are more contradictory, because the framework of ultra processing, and I'm just saying this sentence of a paper we published, the framework of ultra processing moves the focus away from nutrient composition solely to a global focus on the nature and the purpose of food production and processing, sometimes considering these dimensions are contradictory rather than complementary. So according to this framework, product reformulation is not the solution for food industry. But I do understand that there could be limited biological possibility. And as you can see here, we talked about the purpose of food production and the purpose of using a food additive. And I have a hard time imagining why we would have a different biological plausibility according to the reason why we used a food additive in a product. I will not go into this, but just let me conclude by this slide saying what we should do now that we know all of these things. We definitely need more research. The research should come from epidemiological studies, but also from randomized controlled trials when possible, in collaboration with toxicologists and other food scientists and scientists in social marketing, etc. This is definitely a complex thing that we're dealing with. We need publicly funded research, and we need interdisciplinary research. We need an operational definition for regulatory purposes. At the moment, we cannot use NOVA on the daily basis to say that this product is ultra-processed or not. So we definitely need a more operational classification. We need to maybe add some information once we have this classification, so the consumer would have the information whether the food is ultra-processed or not. So this is an example of an experimental study we did. I will not go into detail, but I would be happy to answer your questions. We need to empower citizens with better information on food processing. We need to reevaluate some food additives. We need to protect some schools and other learning environments, but also a reduction of ultra-processed food marketing. So food processing is essential to sustainable food systems and food security. We do have some mounting evidence about epidemiological associations, but the NOVA classification at the current state is not perfect. We definitely need a better classification. We do not need to overlook what we know about nutrient profile. We just need to combine nutrient profile with food processing to have a more complete image of what's happening there. So let me just conclude by thanking all the team for these studies, and thank you for your attention.